May 15th, 1818, London. The candlelight in Lady Pembroke's ballroom flickered across a sea of silk and jewels, casting shadows that seemed to know precisely where to fall and where to avoid. Eleanor Ashford stood at the very edge of the glittering assembly, her position as much a statement of her place in society as any words could convey. At 28, she had long since learned where she belonged in these glittering spaces. At the periphery, neither fully absent nor truly present, like a piece of furniture grown so familiar it ceased to draw the eye. Her gown, a pale blue silk that had been fashionable perhaps 5 years prior, had been carefully maintained and cunningly altered, but no amount of careful stitching could disguise its age or transform it into something that might compete with the sumptuous creations swirling past her in a kaleidoscope of current fashion. She had inherited her father's long nose and serious brow, features that might have been called distinguished in a man, but in a woman were simply deemed unfortunate, and her dark hair, though thick and glossy, was dressed simply for lack of a lady's maid, skilled in the elaborate styles currently favoured. The whispers reached her as they always did, carrying clearly despite the music floating down from the orchestra. Lady Henrietta's voice, pitched just loud enough. "Poor Lord Ashford, such a burden to still have her at home." And then Mrs. Weatherby's response. At her age, one would think she'd accept a position as companion and relieve him of the expense. Eleanor's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her fan, but her expression remained serene, a mask perfected over years of such observations. She had long ago resigned herself to her probable future, a governess position perhaps, or companion to some elderly relation, a life lived in the corners of other people's houses, useful but unremarked upon. It was not a future she had dreamed of in her youth, when she had filled her mind with books on astronomy and philosophy, when her tutors had praised her quick mind and her father had promised her she would want for nothing. But poverty and time had a way of rewriting such stories. The scent of hothouse roses hung heavy in the warm air, cloying and sweet, mixing with the perfumes of 200 bodies pressed into elegant proximity. Eleanor was preparing to retreat to the terrace for air, when her gaze, sweeping the room with practiced disinterest, caught on a figure across the ballroom. Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornmere, stood in conversation with Lord Pembroke, his tall frame elegant in perfectly tailored evening clothes. She knew him by reputation only, naval hero, returned from sea, owner of a merchant fleet that had made him wealthy beyond the already considerable fortune of his title. As if sensing her observation, his eyes lifted and met hers across the crowded space. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its proper measure, they simply looked at one another. Then Eleanor, certain she had imagined any recognition in that glance, gathered her skirts and slipped through the terrace doors into the cooler darkness beyond, seeking refuge in the shadows where she had always belonged. The terrace stones were cool beneath Eleanor's thin slippers, and she breathed deeply of the night air, grateful for its clarity after the suffocating atmosphere within. She had perhaps 3 minutes before propriety would demand she return, or risk further censure for lingering alone in the darkness, but she would take what small freedom she could claim. The sound of the door opening behind her sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest, followed by resignation as she prepared to deflect whatever cutting remark was coming. But the voice that spoke was deeper than she expected, male and measured. "Miss Ashford, I hope I am not intruding upon your solitude." She turned to find the Duke of Thornmere standing in the doorway, the light from the ballroom creating a halo effect around his tall frame before he stepped forward and the door closed behind him, leaving them in the softer illumination of the terrace lanterns. "Your Grace," she managed, offering a curtsy that she prayed appeared more graceful than she felt. "I was merely taking the air." He moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested military training. His profile was strong, she noticed, all clean lines and controlled composure. "It is rather stifling within," he agreed. And then, after a pause that felt both comfortable and charged, "I noticed you earlier. You appeared to be studying the room with the attention of a navigator charting unfamiliar waters." The unexpected observation startled a small laugh from her before she could contain it. "I suppose I was, in a manner of speaking. One must always know where the dangerous currents lie." He turned to look at her directly then, and she found his eyes were a surprising shade of grey, the colour of the sea before a storm. "A wise practice," he said. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, do you have an interest in navigation?" The question was so far from anything she might have anticipated that she simply answered honestly. "I have always been fascinated by celestial navigation, though I confess my knowledge is purely theoretical. My father's library contained several volumes on astronomy, and I spent many hours studying the principles. Alexander, for she found herself already thinking of him by his given name, though she would never speak it, seemed genuinely interested. The calculation of position by the stars is perhaps the most elegant marriage of mathematics and observation," he said. "When at sea, there is something profoundly humbling about determining one's place in the world by looking upward rather than around." She was about to respond, her mind already forming thoughts on the philosophical implications of his observation, when the terrace door opened with rather more force than necessary. Lady Caroline Pembroke stood, framed in the light, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of concern that did not quite reach her calculating eyes. "Your Grace, there you are. Lord Pembroke has been searching for you everywhere. And Miss Ashford, how unexpected to find you monopolizing the Duke's attention. I'm sure you would not wish to keep him from more pressing social obligations." The dismissal was clear, wrapped though it was in the velvet of polite words. But Alexander turned to Caroline with a coolness that surprised Eleanor. "On the contrary, Lady Caroline, I sought out Miss Ashford specifically. We were discussing celestial navigation, a topic on which she displays remarkable knowledge." Caroline's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How very unusual. I confess I find such subjects rather beyond a lady's sphere." "Then perhaps your sphere is more limited than some," Alexander replied with devastating politeness. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether to be mortified or oddly thrilled by his subtle defense. The moment stretched until Caroline, clearly outmaneuvered, retreated with a promise to inform Lord Pembroke of the Duke's location. In the silence that followed her departure, Eleanor gathered what remained of her composure. "I should return inside," she said quietly. "I would not wish to damage your reputation by association with mine." She did not wait for his response, could not bear to see the moment when politeness would force him to agree. As she slipped past him toward the door, she told herself firmly that this had been an aberration, a brief moment of recognition that would not and could not be repeated. By morning, the Duke of Thornmere would surely have forgotten the plain, poor woman with whom he had discussed the stars. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. May 18th, 1818, 3 days after Lady Pembroke's ball, and Eleanor sat in the cramped morning room of the Ashford residence, attempting to focus on mending a chemise that had seen far too many repairs already, when her father burst through the door with an expression she had not seen on his face in years, something caught between shock and desperate hope. "The Duke of Thornmere is here," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "He has asked to speak with me, and has requested permission to take you driving in Hyde Park." Eleanor's needle slipped, pricking her finger, and she watched a small bloom of red appear on the worn fabric, as if observing it from a great distance. "Surely there has been some mistake," she managed, but her father was already shaking his head, already straightening his coat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "No, mistake, my dear. He is quite specific. He is waiting in the drawing room now." The interview that followed took perhaps 10 minutes, though Eleanor experienced it as both endless and impossibly brief, standing just outside the door and hearing the low murmur of male voices, catching only fragments. Your daughter and companionship, and honorable intentions and suitable chaperone, words that seemed to belong to some other woman's life. When her father emerged, his eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously like tears. "He wishes to take you driving this afternoon," he said quietly. "Eleanor, I cannot tell you what to do, but I beg you to consider this opportunity carefully." She wanted to tell him she had already considered and dismissed it as impossible, that dukes did not court penniless daughters of impoverished barons, that this was surely some peculiar whim that would pass, but the hope in his face silenced her objections. Within the hour she found herself seated beside Alexander Ravenscroft in an elegant curricle, his matched greys stepping high as they entered Hyde Park during the fashionable promenade hour when all of society turned out to see and be seen. The shock on faces as they passed was almost comical, had it not been so mortifying. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Fans snapped open to conceal whispered commentary, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 gazes assessing, judging, speculating. Alexander seemed entirely unbothered, guiding his horses with casual expert while he asked her about her education, which books she favored, what subjects had captured her imagination beyond astronomy. She found herself answering more freely than she had intended, speaking of her love of poetry and philosophy, the years she had spent in her father's library, while other young women learned the more practical arts of catching husbands. He listened with an attention that felt almost dangerous in its intensity, asking questions that demonstrated he was truly hearing her answers, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. "I have spent the last 10 years at sea more often than on land," he told her as they completed their circuit of the park. "My fleet is my life's work, 12 ships that carry goods across the world, each one named for a principle I value: freedom, integrity, perseverance. They represent independence, the ability to chart one's own course regardless of what society deems proper or expected." Eleanor understood then that he was telling her something important, offering her a glimpse of the philosophy that guided him, and she felt that fragile, dangerous thing called hope beginning to unfurl in her chest like a sail catching wind. As they returned to her father's house, he handed her down from the curricle with a touch that lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Might I call again tomorrow, Miss Ashford?" he asked, and when she nodded, unable to trust her voice, she saw something in his expression that looked remarkably like satisfaction. May 22, 1818, and the invitation to Lady Caroline's garden party had arrived with the morning post, the fine cream paper and elegant script, making clear that this was no gesture of friendship, but rather a calculated move in a game Eleanor was only beginning to understand. Her cousin Charlotte had insisted on accompanying her, squeezing Eleanor's hand in the carriage with a fierceness that spoke of protective loyalty, whispering that she must not let those vipers see how their poison affected her. The Pembroke Gardens were magnificent, of course, all precisely trimmed hedges and imported roses, creating the perfect backdrop for society's most beautiful and cruel to display themselves to advantage. Eleanor had worn her best day dress, a pale green muslin that was 2 seasons out of fashion, but at least well maintained, and she held her head high as she entered the garden, even as conversations paused and eyes turned toward her with an avidity that made her skin prickle. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes, standing near the refreshment table with Charlotte, when she heard the first whispered comment, not quite soft enough to be truly private. "I simply cannot fathom what the Duke sees in her," Lady Harriet Wilton said to her companion, her fan doing nothing to muffle her words. "Perhaps he finds her intellectual pretensions amusing, or worse, perhaps he has developed peculiar tastes after so many years at sea." The laughter that followed was like crystal shattering, sharp and cutting, and Eleanor felt Charlotte stiffen beside her, preparing to launch a defense that would only draw more attention. Before her cousin could speak, another voice joined the commentary, this one belonging to Miss Sarah Thornbury. "I heard from my brother, who knows the Duke's secretary, that it is some sort of charitable project, proving he can elevate even the most hopeless case through the sheer force of his consequence. How very noble, though one does wonder when the experiment will conclude and he will turn his attention to more suitable prospects." Eleanor forced herself to lift her teacup to her lips, though she tasted nothing, willing her hands not to tremble, reminding herself that she had survived 28 years of society's casual cruelty. And she would survive this too. Charlotte opened her mouth to deliver what was surely a scathing retort, when a ripple of awareness moved through the garden, conversations shifting direction like weather vanes in a changing wind. The Duke of Thornmere had arrived, his tall frame moving through the assembled guests with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to command, and Eleanor watched as Lady Caroline rushed forward to greet him, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of delighted welcome. But Alexander's eyes swept the garden until they found Eleanor, and without pause or acknowledgement of his hostess, he moved directly toward her with such obvious purpose that a hush fell over the immediate vicinity. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "I apologize for my tardiness. I was detained at the bookseller's, but I believe you will find the delay worthwhile." From beneath his coat, he produced a leather-bound volume, placing it in her hands with a care that suggested it was precious. And Eleanor looked down to see a copy of Bowditch's New American Practical Navigator, a text she had mentioned during their drive as one she had always wished to study but could never afford. "I recalled you mentioning your interest in celestial navigation beyond the theoretical," Alexander continued, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, their audience. "This edition includes the most recent lunar distance tables, and I thought we might discuss the practical applications during our drive tomorrow, if you are amenable." Eleanor clutched the book, feeling the weight of it like an anchor, aware that every eye in the garden was now fixed upon them, that Lady Caroline's expression had gone rigid with barely concealed fury, that the women who had been mocking her moments before had fallen into stunned silence. May 28th, 1818, and the royal reception at Carlton House blazed with such light and opulence that Eleanor felt momentarily disoriented as she entered on Alexander's arm, the chandeliers reflecting off gilt surfaces and jewels until the very air seemed to shimmer with wealth and power. This was her first truly royal event, an honour extended because the Duke of Thornmere was in attendance, and the Prince Regent wished to acknowledge his naval contributions to England's commercial dominance, and Eleanor had dressed with particular care in a new gown that Alexander had quietly arranged to be delivered, a deep blue silk that made her feel less like an impostor, though she still caught the familiar whispers trailing in her wake. Alexander had been attentive throughout the evening, introducing her to various members of the diplomatic corps and naval officers, who treated her with a respect that still felt foreign, and she was beginning to relax into the strange new reality of being acknowledged when a ripple of heightened interest moved through the assembled guests, and a gentleman entered with an entourage that spoke of genuine rather than merely English nobility. Prince Frederick of Saxe-Coburg was handsome in the way of portraits and romantic engravings, his features regular and aristocratic, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room, and Eleanor watched as the Prince Regent himself moved forward to greet him with the careful balance of welcome and precedence that governed such encounters. She felt Alexander stiffen beside her, a tension entering his frame that was entirely at odds with his usual controlled composure. And when she glanced up at him in question, she saw his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the prince with an intensity that bordered on hostility. "You know him?" she said quietly. And Alexander nodded once. A sharp movement. "We have a history over naval contracts for his country's merchant interests. He cost me a very lucrative arrangement through political maneuvering 3 years past, and I returned the favor by outbidding him on Mediterranean shipping routes. It is not a friendly rivalry." Eleanor absorbed this information with growing unease, watching as Prince Frederick made his rounds through the reception, noting how his gaze swept the room with a calculation that suggested he was cataloguing useful information and potential advantages. When those eyes landed on her and Alexander, she saw recognition flare, saw the prince pause in his conversation, and then deliberately alter his path to bring him in their direction, and her hand tightened on Alexander's arm in instinctive warning. "The Duke of Thornmere," Prince Frederick said as he approached, his English accented but perfect, his smile charming and entirely devoid of genuine warmth. "What a pleasure to see you in London. I had heard you were spending your time in society rather than at sea these days. Quite a change from your usual habits." His eyes moved to Eleanor with an assessment that made her feel simultaneously visible and dismissed, taking in her gown and appearance with a thoroughness that bordered on rudeness before something shifted in his expression, a spark of interest that looked dangerously like opportunity recognized. "And you must introduce me to your companion. This cannot be the famed beauty lady Caroline, whom I was promised I would meet this evening." Alexander's voice when he spoke was rigidly polite but cold as winter seas. "Your Highness, may I present Miss Eleanor Ashford?" Miss Ashford, Prince Frederick of Saxe-Coburg. June 12, 1818, and the 2 weeks since the royal reception had passed in a manner that felt both dreamlike and more real than anything Eleanor had experienced in her 28 years, because Alexander had called upon her with a consistency that defied society's expectations, and her own lingering disbelief, arriving each afternoon at precisely 3 in the carriage, that no longer drew gasps, but had become an anticipated sight in their modest neighborhood. Their conversations had ranged across subjects she had only ever discussed, with books, philosophy and poetry, and the nature of freedom. And she found herself speaking thoughts she had kept carefully hidden for years, opinions on literature that went beyond proper feminine commentary, observations about society that bordered on radical, and instead of the polite dismissal she expected, he leaned forward with an intensity that suggested he was truly listening, truly interested in the workings of her mind. Her father had grown increasingly hopeful and correspondingly anxious, reminding her at breakfast each morning that the Duke was the finest match she could ever dream of securing, that she must be agreeable and pleasant. And while Eleanor understood his desperation, she felt the familiar weight of being a burden whose value lay only in what advantageous connection she might secure. Charlotte had visited frequently, bringing news of society's continued speculation and increasingly confused commentary, because the Duke showed no signs of losing interest despite their predictions, and her cousin had taken Eleanor's hands and said with fierce certainty that she saw genuine affection in his eyes, that this was not charity or curiosity, but something far more significant. Then, on this particular afternoon, Alexander had arrived with an unusual request, asking if she would accompany him not to the park or a gallery, but to the London docks where his merchant fleet was harboured. And though Eleanor's father had looked uncertain about the propriety, Charlotte had volunteered to accompany them as chaperone, sensing this was somehow important. The docks were a world entirely foreign to Eleanor's limited experience, all salt air and creaking timber and shouting men, the Thames stretching wide and grey beneath a sky-threatening rain, and she had felt momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer scale and activity until Alexander's hand settled at her elbow, steadying and warm even through her spencer. He had walked her along the wharf, pointing out each of his vessels with a pride that was understated but unmistakable, telling her their names and histories, how the Meridian had survived a hurricane off Gibraltar, how the Compass Rose had been his first ship purchased with his naval prize money, how each represented years of his life and work, and the freedom he had built for himself, outside the confines of aristocratic expectation. "This fleet is my life's work," he had said quietly, standing before the largest vessel, a 3-masted merchant ship called the Navigator that rocked gently at anchor. "Everything I have built that is mine alone, not inherited or granted by title, but earned. I wanted you to see this, to understand what my life has been before I met you, and what I hope it might become." Eleanor had looked up at him then, seeing something vulnerable beneath his usual composure, and she understood with sudden clarity that he was sharing something profound, trusting her with the thing he valued most. He had offered his hand to help her board the Navigator, and when she placed her palm in his, she felt the calluses there, evidence of a man who had worked with his own hands despite his rank, and their fingers had lingered together for a moment longer than necessity required, the first truly deliberate physical connection between them, and Eleanor felt the touch all the way through her body, like a promise of something she barely dared to name. June 16th, 1818, and the cream-coloured card that arrived at the Ashford residence bore Lady Caroline Pembroke's elegant script inviting Eleanor to an intimate afternoon tea, and though every instinct warned her against accepting, her father had urged her to attend, reminding her that Lady Caroline was the most influential hostess in London, and refusing such an invitation would be seen as the worst sort of social presumption now that the Duke himself was paying her attention. Eleanor arrived at the Pembroke townhouse at the appointed hour, wearing her second-best afternoon dress, and feeling immediately that she had made a grave error, because the drawing-room was filled not with the casual gathering she had anticipated, but with a carefully selected audience of society's most formidable women, each positioned like judges at a tribunal, with Lady Caroline presiding from her chair near the window, where the light rendered her beauty almost ethereal. The conversation had been pleasant enough at first, inquiries about her father's health and observations about the unusually fine weather, but then Lady Caroline had smiled with a sympathy that felt like a blade, and said how remarkable it was that the Duke continued his calls, and the other women had murmured agreement with expressions that ranged from pity to poorly concealed amusement. "My dear Miss Ashford," Lady Caroline continued, her voice honey-sweet and utterly merciless, "we feel it is our duty as women of experience to help you understand the situation clearly, so that you might protect yourself from inevitable disappointment. The Duke of Thornmere is one of the most eligible gentlemen in England, wealthy beyond measure, titled, and despite his years at sea quite presentable in appearance. He will marry, certainly, but his Duchess must bring connections and beauty and youth to the match, must be someone who can manage his great households and represent his interests in the highest circles of society." Another woman, a Viscountess whose name Eleanor could not recall through the rushing in her ears, leaned forward with false kindness, and added that Eleanor must surely recognize her own limitations. And then they catalogued those limitations with systematic cruelty, each word landing like a stone thrown with careful aim. Her age, 28, and well past the bloom of youth that gentlemen preferred. Her appearance, pleasant perhaps, but lacking the beauty that a duke's wife required. Her poverty, so profound that her dress today was clearly remade from an older garment. Her connections, a father who was barely gentry and held no influence whatsoever in political or social spheres. Her complete lack of experience managing even a modest household, let alone the multiple estates that came with the Thornmere title. Lady Caroline delivered the final assessment with a sigh of seeming regret, suggesting that the Duke was perhaps testing the bounds of charity, or possibly had some peculiar taste for intellectual conversation that Eleanor temporarily satisfied, but that he would inevitably recognize the impossibility of any serious attachment and choose appropriately from among the suitable candidates. "You must prepare yourself, Miss Ashford," she said with that terrible gentle sympathy, "for the moment when he comes to his senses and turns his attention where it properly belongs. It would be kinder to withdraw now, to protect your dignity and allow him to pursue a match worthy of his station. We tell you this as a kindness, so that you are not destroyed when reality asserts itself." Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, teacup trembling in her hand, feeling every fragile hope of the past weeks crumbling into dust beneath the weight of truths she had always known but had allowed herself to forget. June 17th, 1818, and when Alexander arrived at the Ashford residence at precisely 3 in the afternoon, as had become his unwavering custom, Eleanor sent word through the housekeeper that she was indisposed and unable to receive visitors, watching from behind her bedroom curtain as confusion crossed his features before he returned to his carriage, and the sight of his retreating form made her chest ache, even as she told herself this was necessary. This was self-preservation. This was the only way to protect what remained of her dignity before the inevitable occurred. The following day brought a note in his distinctive hand, inquiring after her health and expressing hope that he might call again soon, and Eleanor had responded with a brief message thanking him for his concern and suggesting perhaps it would be best if they did not continue their acquaintance, as it was surely taking time from more important matters. The formal distance of her words so different from their recent conversations that even writing them made her feel ill. On June 19th, he called again and again. She refused him, and she could hear the tension in his voice as he spoke with her father, asking if some offense had been given or if there was anything that required his attention, and her father had no answers to provide beyond assurances of Eleanor's general well-being that satisfied no one. The notes continued, each one more direct than the last, asking what had changed, requesting the courtesy of an explanation, and Eleanor responded to each with increasing formality until she was writing the sort of empty pleasantries that might be exchanged between the barest of acquaintances, and she knew from the brief replies that came back that her withdrawal was not merely confusing him, but causing genuine distress. Yet she could not stop, because Lady Caroline's words echoed in her mind with the weight of absolute truth. On the afternoon of June 20th, Charlotte arrived unannounced and marched past the startled housekeeper directly to Eleanor's room, finding her cousin sitting in the window seat with a book she was not reading, and Charlotte demanded without preamble to know what had happened. What could possibly account for this sudden change, when just days ago Eleanor had been happier than Charlotte had ever seen her? Eleanor tried to deflect, to claim nothing was wrong, but Charlotte was relentless, and finally the entire terrible story poured out. Lady Caroline's tea party and the systematic destruction of every fragile hope, the catalogue of inadequacies that Eleanor knew were true, the certainty that Alexander would eventually recognize the impossibility of their attachment and the necessity of protecting herself before that recognition arrived. Charlotte listened with growing fury and then took Eleanor's hands and said with fierce conviction that Lady Caroline was a vicious creature threatened by the genuine connection Eleanor and Alexander shared, and more importantly that Alexander had been making inquiries throughout society about Eleanor's favorite flowers and preferred colors, that he had been seen consulting with jewelers on Bond Street, that everything in his behavior suggested a man preparing to make an offer of marriage, not a man merely amusing himself. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, hope and terror warring so violently she could barely breathe, wanting desperately to believe but unable to overcome the weight of evidence that society had provided about her own unworthiness, and she confessed to Charlotte that she was terrified, that if she allowed herself to hope fully and then lost him, it would destroy something essential in her that had survived 28 years of resignation. Charlotte held her while she wept, and then said softly that love required courage, that Eleanor had to decide whether to risk the pain of potential loss or guarantee the pain of deliberate rejection, and Eleanor knew she was right, but could not yet force herself to reverse course. On June 21st, Alexander arrived at the Ashford residence at midday rather than his usual afternoon hour, and when Eleanor sent her refusal, he did not depart, but instead informed the housekeeper that he would wait, and he remained on the doorstep for 3 hours until Eleanor's father finally intervened, and Eleanor heard raised voices from below, though she could not discern the words, and then Alexander's footsteps on the stairs, her father's protest, and then the Duke of Thornmere was standing in her doorway with an expression that was equal parts frustration and desperation, demanding to know what had changed, and refusing to accept anything less than the truth. Eleanor stood from her chair with her back to the window, attempting to compose herself into the formal distance she had maintained in her notes. But Alexander closed the door behind him with careful control and said in a voice tight with frustration that he had been patient. He had sent inquiries and received meaningless pleasantries in return, and he would not leave this room until she explained what had so dramatically altered between them when just 5 days prior they had stood together at the docks, and she had smiled at him with what he had believed was genuine affection. She tried to speak, to manufacture some acceptable excuse about reconsidering the appropriateness of their acquaintance, but he crossed the room in 3 strides and said he wanted the truth, not the sort of polite fiction she had been writing, and she could see the desperation beneath his controlled exterior, the way his hands flexed at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her but restrained himself. "What did they tell you?" he demanded. "What poison has society planted that has convinced you to withdraw so completely?" And the directness of his question shattered what remained of Eleanor's composure, because she could not maintain pretense in the face of such raw honesty. "Lady Caroline invited me to tea," she said quietly, and the words came tumbling out in a rush, the careful catalogue of her inadequacies, the systematic explanation of why a duke could never seriously intend marriage to someone so thoroughly unsuitable, the terrible kindness with which they had detailed every reason she was destined for disappointment. Alexander listened with growing fury that transformed his features, and when she finished, he said with barely controlled rage that Caroline Pembroke was a vicious creature who could not tolerate seeing genuine connection because she had never experienced it herself. And then his voice softened, and he asked Eleanor to look at him, truly look at him, and tell him if she believed he was the sort of man who would spend weeks in deliberate courtship as some form of cruel amusement. She met his eyes and saw something in them that made her breath catch, an intensity of feeling that he had kept carefully controlled until this moment. And he said that for 34 years he had moved through society feeling utterly alone, surrounded by people who wanted his title or his wealth or his influence, but never saw him as anything beyond those external trappings. "When I spoke with you on Lady Pembroke's terrace," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "you discussed navigation and the stars with such intelligence and passion that for the first time in my life I felt truly seen not as a duke or a naval commander, but as a man with thoughts and interests that mattered beyond their utility. Every conversation since has only deepened that feeling. Every moment in your company has been a revelation of what connection might actually mean. And you believe I would abandon that because society has opinions about your age or your father's fortune. Eleanor felt tears beginning to fall as he spoke, the careful walls she had built crumbling under the weight of his words. And when he reached out to take her hands, she did not pull away but gripped his fingers as if they were the only solid thing in a world that had turned uncertain. "I see your worth, Eleanor," he said with fierce conviction. "I see your intelligence and your dignity and your capacity for genuine feeling, and those qualities are rarer and more valuable than anything society pretends to measure." He told her he had been preparing to make his intentions clear in a more formal manner, but that her withdrawal had forced his hand, that he could not bear another day of her believing herself unworthy when the truth was, he felt unworthy of her, of the gift of being truly known by another person. She whispered that she was terrified, that allowing herself to hope fully felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, and he said softly that he understood fear, but that he was asking her to trust him, to give him time to prove that his feelings were not some temporary aberration, but a certainty that had only grown stronger with each passing day. The evening of June 23rd, 1818, brought Lady Harrington's musicale, an event Eleanor attended with cautious optimism restored by Alexander's declaration, arriving on his arm with a consciousness that society watched their every movement with sharpened interest and speculation that had shifted from mockery to genuine curiosity about the Duke's unprecedented courtship of someone so thoroughly unsuitable by conventional measures. Alexander had been attentive throughout the week following their confrontation in her room, calling each day with unwavering consistency, and Eleanor had allowed herself to hope with less reservation, though doubt still whispered at the edges of her newfound confidence. And she noticed how his hand at her elbow guided her through the assembled guests with a possessiveness that was both thrilling and slightly unsettling in its intensity. They had just settled into seats near the pianoforte where a young soprano was preparing to perform when a ripple of excitement moved through the room, heads turning toward the entrance with the sort of collective anticipation that signaled the arrival of someone of significant importance. And Eleanor followed the general gaze to see a man of remarkable handsomeness entering with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, his features aristocratic, and his bearing unmistakably royal. She felt Alexander stiffen beside her, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on hers, and she glanced at his face to find an expression of controlled displeasure that transformed his usual reserve into something cold and watchful, and she whispered a question about the newcomer even as Lady Harrington rushed forward with effusive greetings that confirmed Eleanor's suspicion that this was someone of considerable rank. "Prince Frederick of Saxe-Coburg," Alexander murmured in response, his voice carefully neutral but with an undertone that suggested history between them. And Eleanor watched as the prince accepted Lady Harrington's attentions with practiced charm before his gaze swept the room with the assessing quality of someone cataloguing useful information. And she felt the moment his eyes found Alexander because something shifted in his expression, a sharpening of interest that made her unaccountably uneasy. The prince made his way through the assembled guests with unhurried grace, accepting introductions and bestowing attention with the discrimination of someone who understood the power of selective favor. And Eleanor told herself there was no reason for the growing tension she felt in Alexander's posture, or the way his attention had fixed on the prince's, progress with the focus of a naval commander tracking an enemy vessel. When Prince Frederick finally reached them, Lady Harrington performed introductions with barely concealed excitement at facilitating such an illustrious meeting, and the prince greeted Alexander with warmth that did not quite reach his calculating eyes, making reference to their last meeting at some naval function in Portsmouth, where apparently a contract for shipping supplies to the continent had been under discussion. Eleanor found herself subjected to the prince's full attention as he requested introduction to Alexander's companion, and the way he took her hand and bowed over it with exquisite courtesy, while saying he was enchanted to meet anyone who had captured the Duke of Thornmere's notoriously difficult-to-obtain interest, made her feel both flattered and oddly exposed, as if she were being evaluated for purposes she could not discern. The prince settled into conversation with them, despite clear signals from Alexander that his presence was not welcome, asking Eleanor about her interests with a charm that seemed designed to draw her out, and she found herself responding to his questions about literature and music, while acutely aware of Alexander's barely suppressed irritation beside her. When Prince Frederick expressed delight at her knowledge and suggested he must host a gathering where such conversation could continue, extending an invitation to a river party on the Thames the following week where he promised entertainment worthy of their attendance, Eleanor glanced at Alexander to find him regarding the prince with an expression that in any other man might be called hostile, and the prince met that gaze with a slight smile that suggested he had achieved precisely the reaction he desired, and Eleanor realized with dawning unease that she had somehow become a piece in a game whose rules she did not understand. The river party on June 28, 1818, unfolded with such elaborate magnificence that it seemed designed to overwhelm the sense and distract from the calculating purpose beneath its splendor, with 3 royal barges decorated in silk and flowers anchored in a strategic position on the Thames, where the water reflected the afternoon sun and created an atmosphere of fairy tale unreality that made Eleanor feel as if she had stepped into a scene from some fantastical story where she did not quite belong. She arrived with Alexander, whose tension was palpable despite his controlled demeanor, his hand at her back possessive as they boarded the largest barge where Prince Frederick greeted them with expansive warmth that felt performative, his smile never quite reaching eyes that assessed them with the cool calculation of someone executing a carefully designed strategy. The prince insisted on personally escorting Eleanor through the various entertainments he had arranged, a quartet playing beneath a silk canopy, tables laden with delicacies from the continent, and servants, circulating with champagne in crystal glasses that caught the light and sparkled like the false promise of the entire afternoon, and she felt Alexander's reluctance to release her warring with his inability to refuse a royal request without causing offense that would reflect poorly on them both. Prince Frederick guided her to the rail of the royal barge with a proprietary touch that made her uncomfortable, pointing out features of the other vessels and speaking of palaces he had visited in Vienna and Paris, courts where beauty and wit were properly appreciated, and rewarded with positions of influence and security that even the wealthiest English noble could not provide. And his words carried an undertone she could not quite decipher, but that made her increasingly uneasy. She glanced back to find Alexander watching them with an intensity that suggested barely restrained fury, his conversation with Lord Harrington clearly a pretense, while his attention remained fixed on her location, and she realized that whatever was unfolding between these 2 men had very little to do with her actual person and everything to do with some competition she had not agreed to enter. The prince led her to a more secluded area of the barge, ostensibly to show her a better view of the Thames bridges, but the privacy felt deliberate and threatening, and he turned to her with a smile that no longer bothered with pretense of genuine warmth, and said that surely she understood her position was precarious, attached to a duke by no formal arrangement, while society waited to see if his interest would fade, as such things often did. He spoke of security and certainty, of how a woman in her circumstances might benefit from the patronage of someone with resources that transcended national boundaries, how he could offer her things that even Alexander with all his ships and wealth could not provide, titles and position that would make her untouchable by the cruel judgments of English society that had dismissed her for so long. Eleanor felt cold understanding settling over her as she recognized that she was being used as a piece in a game of masculine pride and rivalry, that Prince Frederick cared nothing for her as a person, but saw her only as a means to wound Alexander and prove some point about power and precedence that had nothing to do with genuine feeling. Before she could formulate a response that balanced dignity with the political necessity of not offending royalty, Alexander appeared at her side with the swift purposefulness of someone who had been restraining himself with difficulty, and the look he directed at Prince Frederick carried such barely contained hostility that the air between them seemed to crackle with tension, and Frederick met that gaze with a slight smile that acknowledged the challenge and suggested he welcomed it, and Eleanor understood with sinking dread that the situation was spiraling toward confrontation that would destroy whatever fragile peace her life had recently achieved. The 4 days following the river party transformed Eleanor's tentative happiness into a suffocating anxiety as Prince Frederick continued his calculated pursuit with a relentlessness that felt less like courtship and more like siege warfare designed to prove a point that had nothing to do with genuine feeling. His gifts arriving each morning with elaborate presentation that drew attention from neighbors and passers-by, who watched the Ashford residence with the avid interest of spectators at a theatrical performance. On July the 2nd, a hothouse arrangement of exotic orchids arrived, with a card referencing palaces in Vienna where such flowers grew in royal conservatories. On July 3rd, a jeweled fan that Eleanor's father valued at more than their annual income and looked at with an expression of desperate hope that made her feel ill. On July the 4th, a first-edition volume of poetry so rare that even Alexander, with all his resources, would struggle to acquire it. Each gift a calculated escalation designed to demonstrate that the prince's resources transcended anything a mere English duke could offer. Society had seized upon the competition with voracious enthusiasm, every drawing room in London dissecting the unprecedented situation of 2 such illustrious men pursuing someone as thoroughly unremarkable as Eleanor Ashford, and the speculation ranged from romantic interpretations that made her seem like a heroine from a novel to cruel assessments that she must possess some hidden appeal of the sort that could not be mentioned in polite company. And Eleanor felt herself transforming from person into symbol of a masculine rivalry that cared nothing for her actual humanity. She tried to return the gifts, but Prince Frederick's servants had instructions to refuse, and when she attempted to send a note requesting he cease his attentions, he responded with an invitation to the opera in a box adjacent to the royal party, an invitation that came with the weight of social expectation that made refusal difficult without causing offense that could impact her father's already precarious position. Alexander called each day with a desperation poorly concealed beneath his controlled demeanor, and Eleanor watched him struggle against instincts trained by years of naval command and aristocratic restraint, his need to claim and protect warring with an inability to articulate emotions in ways that might reassure her that she mattered beyond the game being played, and she found herself growing resentful of being treated like territory to be defended rather than a person whose feelings deserved consideration. On July the 5th, she finally gave voice to the anger that had been building beneath her anxiety, asking Alexander in her father's drawing room if his attentions were truly about her or merely about defeating the prince in some contest of masculine pride, and she watched him struggle to answer, his jaw tightening and his hands clenching as if he wanted to reach for her but could not bridge the distance between what he felt and what he could express. He told her she did not understand the situation, that Prince Frederick was dangerous in ways she could not perceive, that his pursuit was designed specifically to wound Alexander through her, and she responded that she understood perfectly that she was being used as a pawn by both of them, that neither seemed capable of seeing her as anything beyond a prize to be won or a weapon to be wielded, and the words emerged with a bitterness that surprised her because she had not realized how much anger lived beneath her fear. Alexander looked stricken, his careful control fracturing to reveal genuine distress, and he tried to explain that his feelings were real even if he struggled to express them properly, that his concern for her safety and reputation was not about possession, but about genuine care. But the words came haltingly and without the eloquence that might have bridged the chasm opening between them. They parted in painful tension, Eleanor retreating to her room with the taste of ashes in her mouth, and Alexander departing with shoulders rigid with frustrated emotion. And she understood that tomorrow would bring more gifts from the prince, and more attention from society, and more of this unbearable game that was destroying the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. The request for a private audience arrived on the morning of July the 6th, delivered by a royal messenger whose very presence at the Ashford residence drew curious stares from neighbours and passers-by, the cream-coloured envelope bearing the seal of Saxe-Coburg, and containing an invitation phrased with such careful formality that it seemed impossible to refuse without causing offence that could have diplomatic ramifications beyond Eleanor's personal situation. She knew accepting was foolish, that nothing good could come from a private conversation with a man who had demonstrated such calculating interest in using her as a weapon. But the alternative of refusing a prince carried its own dangers for her father, whose minor title and precarious finances left him vulnerable to the displeasure of those with greater power and influence. Charlotte arrived within the hour of receiving Eleanor's note, her expression grim but determined, and together they prepared to receive Prince Frederick at 2 o'clock that afternoon in the shabby drawing-room that Eleanor had once tried to see through Alexander's eyes and now viewed through the lens of certain humiliation. The prince arrived precisely on time with an attendant who remained in the hall while Frederick entered with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to having his presence welcomed and his desires accommodated, his handsome face arranged in an expression of warm concern that did not reach eyes that assessed the room's worn furnishings and faded wallpaper with the cool calculation of someone taking inventory of weakness. He began with pleasantries that felt like a cat toying with captured prey, inquiring after Eleanor's health and commenting on the charming intimacy of her home, and she forced herself to respond with the polite formality her father had drilled into her from childhood, while Charlotte sat rigidly beside her as witness and protection. Then Frederick shifted, his tone becoming more direct as he said he wished to make his intentions clear without the confusion that seemed to have clouded their previous interactions, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with dread as she recognized the preamble to something that would shatter whatever fragile dignity she had managed to maintain. He spoke of palaces, specifically a residence he controlled in the German principalities that stood empty and could be made available to someone whose companionship he valued, and he mentioned an income that would be settled upon her and provision made for her father's debts. And the words were delivered with such careful precision that it took Eleanor several moments to fully comprehend that he was offering not marriage, but the position of acknowledged mistress, an arrangement that would provide financial security in exchange for her person and her reputation. She felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her, the humiliation so complete and devastating that for a moment she could not draw breath, and Charlotte's hand found hers and gripped tight as the prince continued with horrible clarity to explain that his rivalry with the Duke of Thornmere stemmed from Alexander's interference in naval contracts that had cost Frederick considerable sums, and that Eleanor's choice between them would demonstrate who truly held power and whose suit deserved precedence. He said these things without shame or attempt at romantic pretense, laying bare that she had never been anything more than a convenient pawn in a game of masculine pride. And Eleanor felt something harden in her chest beneath the humiliation, a core of dignity that refused to shatter despite everything. She stood with careful control and told him in a voice that shook only slightly that she must decline his generous offer, that she would not accept a position that held no honor regardless of the financial advantages. And she asked him to leave her home with a firmness that surprised her, given the trembling in her limbs. Frederick's expression shifted to cold displeasure as he rose and told her she would regret choosing poverty and uncertainty over security, that the Duke would tire of his infatuation and she would find herself with nothing, and that when that happened, she should not expect his offer to remain available. And then he departed, leaving Eleanor and Charlotte in silence. That felt like the aftermath of a storm that had torn away every illusion and left only devastating truth exposed. Prince Frederick did not possess the grace to accept rejection in private, and Eleanor should have anticipated that a man who had used her so callously as a weapon would not hesitate to deliver the final blow in the most public manner possible, but she had allowed herself to hope that even cruelty had limits, a hope that shattered completely on the evening of July 9th at Lady Pembroke's ball, where all of fashionable London had gathered in the overheated ballroom that smelled of perfume and candle wax and the sharp scent of social ambition. Eleanor had not wished to attend, but her father had insisted with a desperation that made her understand how precarious their position had become, and Charlotte had accompanied her with grim determination, both of them aware that society was watching the conclusion of the rivalry with the hungry attention of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. She had dressed with care in a gown that was still 3 seasons out of fashion, but the best she possessed, and she had entered the ballroom with her chin raised and her hands steady despite the trembling in her limbs. And she had seen Alexander across the room, his expression lightening with relief when their eyes met. But before he could reach her side, the music had stopped, and Prince Frederick had stepped onto the dais reserved for announcements with the easy confidence of royalty accustomed to commanding attention. The room fell silent with the abruptness of a door slamming shut, and Eleanor felt ice spreading through her chest as Frederick smiled with perfect charm and began to speak about generosity and the obligations of those blessed with fortune to assist those in more difficult circumstances, and she understood what was coming in the terrible moment before he said her name. He announced before the assembled crowd that he had made a most generous offer to Miss Eleanor Ashford, a woman whose circumstances required the protection and security that only a man of substantial means could provide, and he detailed with horrible precision the palace in the German principalities, the income to be settled, the provision for her family's debts, and the nature of the arrangement she would occupy in his household, and the words mistress and companion were never spoken directly but hung in the air with perfect clarity, as society gasped and then erupted in whispers that sounded like wasps swarming. Eleanor stood frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, her face burning with humiliation, so complete it felt like a physical wound, and she watched Frederick frame his insulting offer as magnanimous charity while simultaneously making clear she had refused him, painting her as both presumptuous in aspiring beyond her station and foolish in declining security for uncertain prospects with a duke whose interest might prove as temporary as a summer infatuation. Lady Caroline laughed, the sound bright and cruel as breaking glass, and others joined her, the mockery spreading through the ballroom like fire through dry timber, and Eleanor heard whispers about her audacity in thinking herself worthy of either prince or duke, about the absurdity of 2 such men competing for someone so thoroughly unremarkable, about her age and appearance and poverty being exposed for everyone to judge and find wanting. She saw Alexander pushing through the crowd toward her, his face transformed with a rage that made people step back in alarm. But she could not bear for him to reach her, could not endure his pity or his anger on her behalf when she had become the instrument of his public humiliation, and she turned and fled the ballroom with what remained of her dignity, Charlotte following close behind, and the sound of laughter and scandal chased them into the night, where her father's shabby carriage waited to carry her home through streets that seemed darker than they had ever been before. Eleanor refused to see anyone in the days that followed, retreating to her chamber where the curtains remained drawn against daylight that felt too harsh for eyes that burned from weeping, and she existed in a twilight world where shame pressed down like a physical weight that made drawing breath an act of will rather than instinct. Her father had knocked on the door the morning after the ball and asked through the locked wood if she had considered the prince's offer more carefully, and the tentative hope in his voice had been another wound because she understood his desperation even as she could not become what Frederick wanted her to be, could not trade her person for the solution to debts that had accumulated through no fault of her own, but would destroy them nonetheless. Charlotte arrived each day and was admitted where others were turned away, sitting beside Eleanor in the dim room and holding her hand while the sounds of London filtered through the windows, the ordinary life of a city that continued regardless of personal devastation. And on the second day, Charlotte brought news that society was feasting on the scandal with the enthusiasm of wolves on a fresh kill. Lady Caroline Pembroke had hosted a tea where Eleanor's audacity was discussed with savage delight, the consensus being that she had aimed far above her station, and that both prince and duke had now recognized the absurdity of their temporary interest in someone so thoroughly unremarkable. And there were cruel speculations about what Eleanor might have done to capture even fleeting attention, suggestions that cast shadows on her character and virtue that could never be fully dispelled. Alexander had sent messages that arrived with painful regularity, notes delivered by his footman, who waited fruitlessly for responses that Eleanor could not bring herself to write. Because what could she say to the man whose reputation she had damaged through the simple fact of existing in his orbit, whose name was now linked in scandal to a woman society had decided was worthy only of mockery and pity? She read his words through tears that blurred the ink, his requests to see her and assurances that nothing had changed in his regard. But she knew better than to believe that he could still want her after she had become a source of public humiliation, after Prince Frederick had made clear to all of London exactly how little value she possessed. On the third day, which was July 12th and marked 72 hours since she had fled Lady Pembroke's ballroom, Eleanor heard raised voices in the entrance hall below, her father's protests and Alexander's deeper tones, insisting with a firmness that brooked no refusal that he would not leave until he had spoken with her. And when Charlotte came to tell her that the Duke was sitting on their doorstep and had announced his intention to remain there regardless of weather or propriety, Eleanor felt something crack in the shell of shame that had enclosed her. She descended the stairs with trembling legs to find Alexander in their shabby drawing-room, his appearance dishevelled in a way she had never seen before, his cravat loosened and his eyes shadowed with lack of sleep. And when he saw her, he rose with such relief that for a moment she could almost believe she still mattered. She told him with as much dignity as she could summon that she released him from any obligation, real or imagined, that he should forget her and choose someone whose presence would bring him honor rather than scandal. And she watched his expression shift from relief to something fierce and determined as he crossed the room and took her hands in his and told her in a voice that shook with barely controlled emotion to trust him, that he had a plan that would make society understand what he had known from the first moment he had seen her standing alone at the edge of a ballroom. Alexander left the Ashford residence on the afternoon of July the 12th with the weight of Eleanor's despair still clinging to him like fog from the Thames, and he walked through the streets of London with a purposeful stride that made those in his path move aside without quite understanding why they felt compelled to do so. And within the hour he arrived at his shipping offices near the docks, where the smell of tar and salt water hung perpetually in the air, and the sounds of commerce and labour created a symphony he had understood since boyhood, when he had first gone to sea. He summoned his business managers and captains with terse messages that brought them hurrying to his private office, where maps of the Thames covered one wall and ledgers documenting his fleet's movements and profits lined the shelves in neat rows that represented years of careful work and calculated risk. And when 8 men had assembled before his desk, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, Alexander announced his intention to deliberately sink his entire merchant fleet in a pattern that would spell Eleanor's name across the Thames, visible from every fashionable window and bridge in London. The silence that followed his declaration lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but felt longer, broken finally by his senior manager, James Thornton, who had served Alexander for 15 years and survived 3 naval engagements and countless storms, but looked now as if he had been struck by lightning, and asked with careful politeness if his grace had perhaps been drinking or suffering from some fever that affected his judgment. Alexander assured them he was in complete possession of his faculties, and proceeded to explain his reasoning with the same clarity he had once used to plan naval maneuvers, spreading a detailed map of the Thames across his desk and marking the precise positions where each vessel must be scuttled to form the letters that would declare to all of society that Eleanor Ashford was worth more than his fortune, worth more than 12 ships that represented his life's work and the foundation of his wealth, worth more than the good opinion of people who measured value in guineas and pedigree rather than character and intelligence. His men exchanged glances that spoke of serious doubts about his sanity, and Captain Marcus Reed, who commanded his largest vessel, ventured to mention the enormous financial loss such an action would entail, the cargo that would be destroyed, the contracts that would be broken, the reputation for reliability that would be shattered. But Alexander cut through their objections with an edge in his voice that reminded them all that he had commanded men in battle and would brook no insubordination when his mind was set. He told them that society had presumed to judge Eleanor and found her wanting based on circumstances of birth and fortune that had nothing to do with her true worth, that a prince had publicly humiliated her as a means of striking at him, and that he would not allow the woman he intended to marry to believe for another day that she was somehow less valuable than gold or property or the empty regard of people whose opinions were formed by malice and envy rather than truth. The planning began then with the meticulous attention to detail that had made Alexander successful in both naval and commercial ventures, calculations of tide and current, precise measurements of distance and angle, schedules coordinated to the hour so that each ship would settle in its designated position, and most importantly, the arrangements to ensure every crew member would be safely evacuated before their vessel went down, because Alexander would sacrifice his fortune but not a single life in this demonstration. His men remained doubtful but loyal, and as the afternoon stretched into evening and the plans took shape with increasing specificity, Alexander sat down at his desk and drew out fresh paper and wrote a letter to Eleanor explaining what was coming and why, his hand steady as he formed words that laid bare his heart in a way he had never done before, because restraint and emotional control were luxuries he could no longer afford when the woman he loved believed herself unworthy of being loved. Dawn broke over London on July the 15th with a sky the colour of pale pearl, and while most of fashionable society still slept after another night of entertainments and gossip, Alexander Ravenscroft stood on the deck of the merchant vessel Seraphina at her moorings near London Bridge and gave the order that would begin the deliberate destruction of everything he had built across 15 years of commerce and careful investment. The crew had been evacuated in the hours before sunrise, with bonuses that ensured their loyalty and silence, and now only Alexander and Captain Marcus Reed remained aboard as the seacocks were opened and water began rushing into the hold with a sound like the ocean reclaiming what had always belonged to it. And within 10 minutes the ship settled lower in the water, while Alexander and Marcus climbed into the waiting rowboat and pulled away to watch the Seraphina sink in the precise position that would form the first letter of Eleanor's name. By mid-morning, when respectable London was beginning to stir, the second vessel went down in full view of anyone crossing Westminster Bridge, and the confusion began as dock workers and merchants gathered along the Thames to speculate about accidents and navigation errors, while Alexander moved methodically from one ship to the next with his captains, who had committed the coordinates to memory and executed the plan with military precision. Eleanor woke that morning in her chamber with eyes still swollen from weeping, and found a letter that had been slipped under her door sometime in the night, Alexander's handwriting across the envelope that she opened with trembling fingers to read words that made her heart stop, and then race with something between terror and disbelief. He wrote that by the time she read this, the operation would have already begun, that he was sinking every ship in his fleet to spell her name across the Thames so that all of London would be forced to see what he had known from the first moment he spoke with her on Lady Pembroke's terrace, that she was worth more than gold or property or the empty regard of people who measured value in guineas instead of character. He wrote that his fortune meant nothing if she believed herself unworthy, that he would rather be a pauper with her love than a wealthy man alone, and that society must understand she was not the fortunate one in any match between them, but rather he was blessed beyond measure that she had agreed to let him court her at all. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the words penetrated the shell of grief that had enclosed her, and then she was running down the stairs, calling for Charlotte, who arrived within the hour to find Eleanor wild with fear and hope and the terrible understanding that Alexander was destroying himself to prove something she already believed, that his regard was genuine and his love was real. By early afternoon, the news had spread through London with the speed of flame through dry kindling, and society poured from their homes toward the Thames to witness the impossible spectacle of the Duke of Thornmere deliberately sinking ship after ship in a pattern that was beginning to form letters visible from every bridge and fashionable window, and the whispers changed from confusion to shock to awe as the realization spread that he was spelling a name, that he was declaring his love in a way that could never be ignored or dismissed or explained away by those who had mocked Eleanor Ashford and found her wanting. By the hour of 3 in the afternoon on July the 15th, all of fashionable London had abandoned their drawing rooms and afternoon engagements to crowd along every available vantage point overlooking the Thames, and the bridges were so thick with spectators that the usual flow of traffic ground to a complete halt while carriages sat abandoned and their occupants pressed against the railings to witness what could only be described as either the greatest romantic gesture in the history of England or the most spectacular demonstration of madness ever undertaken by a peer of the realm. The 7th ship went down as Eleanor and Charlotte arrived at Westminster Bridge in a hired hackney that had taken twice the usual time to navigate streets clogged with people all moving in the same direction toward the river. And when Eleanor finally stood among the crowds with Charlotte gripping her arm for support, she looked out across the water and saw with perfect clarity the letters that Alexander's fleet was forming across the breadth of the Thames, each sunken vessel marked by floating debris and circling boats ensuring no lives were lost, and the sight struck her with such force that her knees weakened and Charlotte had to hold her upright. The letter E was fully formed near London Bridge, the L taking shape just beyond it, and even those members of society who had mocked Eleanor most cruelly stood silent now as they comprehended the magnitude of what the Duke of Thornmere was doing, destroying ships worth thousands upon thousands of pounds to spell the name of a woman they had deemed unworthy of notice. Prince Frederick stood on the terrace of his borrowed mansion with an unobstructed view of the Thames and a glass of wine that he had not sipped for over an hour, watching his carefully constructed humiliation of a rival transform into his own defeat because there was no palace or title or promise of security that could possibly compete with a man willing to sink his entire fortune to prove a woman's worth. And the fury that burned in his chest was tempered by a grudging recognition that he had been outmaneuvered completely. Lady Caroline Pembroke watched from her own drawing-room windows with a cluster of society women who had gathered that afternoon for cards and gossip, and the whispered commentary that usually filled such gatherings had died to shocked silence as ship after ship settled into position, and Caroline felt something she had not experienced in many years, a sick understanding that she had fundamentally misjudged both the Duke's character and Eleanor Ashford's value, though she would never speak such thoughts aloud. By 5 in the afternoon, when the 11th ship began its controlled descent, Eleanor was weeping openly with no regard for the hundreds of people who could see her tears, and Charlotte wept beside her while explaining to curious onlookers that this was Eleanor Ashford, the woman whose name was being written across London's greatest river in a declaration that would be talked about for generations. The final ship went down as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and the letter R settled into place to complete the name Eleanor in letters so large they could be read from any fashionable address in London, and the crowds that had watched in varying states of shock and awe and disbelief began to cheer with a roar that echoed off the buildings lining the Thames and seemed to shake the very bridges beneath their feet. Alexander appeared at the Ashford residence as the sun descended toward the horizon on July 15th, arriving in a hired carriage because his own was still at the docks and his clothes were soaked through from supervising the final vessel's descent, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead with Thames water and sweat and the exertion of orchestrating the greatest romantic declaration London had ever witnessed. He strode past the butler without waiting for announcement, and found Eleanor in the drawing-room where she had returned with Charlotte after watching the spectacle from Westminster Bridge, and when she turned to see him standing in the doorway, looking like a man who had just fought a naval battle and won, something broke open in her chest that had been locked away since childhood, when she first understood that the world had measured her and found her lacking in all the ways that supposedly mattered. Alexander crossed the room in 4 strides, and then did something that would be reported in every scandal sheet and gossiped about in every drawing-room for weeks to come. He dropped to one knee before her on the worn carpet of her father's modest drawing-room, while outside the windows a crowd had begun to gather, because word had spread through the streets that the Duke of Thornmere was headed to the Ashford residence, and all of London wanted to witness what would happen next in the greatest romance of the age. He took her hand in both of his, and his voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion when he said that he had sunk 12 ships worth more than £5,000 to spell her name across the Thames, because society needed to understand what he had known from the first moment he spoke with her, that Eleanor Ashford was worth more than his entire fortune and every ship he owned and all the gold in the Bank of England, and that he would rather live in poverty with her as his wife than spend another day as a wealthy man alone. Eleanor could not speak for the tears that choked her throat, and the overwhelming reality that this man, who could have chosen any woman in England with her beauty and fortune and perfect pedigree had chosen her, had destroyed his merchant fleet to prove her worth to a world that had dismissed her as unworthy of notice for 28 years. He asked her to marry him with words that were simple and direct, because he had already made his declaration in a way that could never be misunderstood or forgotten. And when Eleanor whispered yes through her tears and pulled him to his feet so she could embrace him without caring who might be watching through the windows, the crowd that had gathered outside erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 streets away. They held each other while Charlotte wept tears of joy, and Eleanor's father appeared in the doorway, looking stunned and relieved and overwhelmed. And through the windows, the Thames was visible with the wreckage of Alexander's fleet, still spelling Eleanor's name in letters large enough to be read from anywhere in fashionable London, a permanent reminder that true love measured worth by different standards than society's cruel and arbitrary rules. Prince Frederick of Saxe-Coburg departed London the following morning without fanfare or farewell, comprehending that no palace or royal title could compete with what Alexander had offered Eleanor. And Lady Caroline Pembroke stood at her drawing-room window, watching the Ashford residence surrounded by celebrating crowds, and felt the cold understanding that she had fundamentally misjudged everything about Eleanor Ashford and the Duke of Thornmere and the nature of love itself. The news of Eleanor Ashford's engagement to Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornmere, spread through London with a velocity that exceeded even the initial shock of the fleet's sinking, and by the morning of July 16th, there was not a drawing-room or gentleman's club in fashionable society where the topic was not being discussed, with reactions that ranged from romantic admiration to cynical speculation to grudging acknowledgement that whatever else might be said about the Duke, no one could question the sincerity of his attachment to a woman for whom he had sacrificed 12 ships and over £5,000. Eleanor woke in her narrow bed in her father's modest townhouse to find that her entire world had transformed overnight. And when she descended to breakfast, she discovered the entrance hall filled with flowers and gifts from well-wishers who 48 hours earlier would have crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her, a hypocrisy so blatant that it might have been amusing if it were not so painful in its reminder of how thoroughly society's estimation of her worth depended entirely on external validation rather than any inherent quality she possessed. Alexander arrived at 10 in the morning looking considerably more presentable than he had the previous evening, dressed impeccably and bearing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and when he slipped it onto Eleanor's finger in the drawing-room with her father, and Charlotte as witnesses, she felt the weight of it as both a promise and a shield against the world that had dismissed her for so long. He told her over tea that the ships had indeed been insured, though not for their full value, and while the financial loss was substantial enough that he would need to curtail some expenses and delay certain business ventures, he was far from ruined and had calculated the cost carefully before undertaking the gesture, because he wanted her to know it was a deliberate choice rather than a moment of uncontrolled passion. Eleanor's father wept openly as he thanked Alexander for restoring not just his daughter's prospects, but her dignity, and Charlotte embraced Eleanor with fierce joy, tempered by the knowledge of how close her cousin had come to being destroyed by society's cruelty before Alexander's dramatic intervention. The afternoon brought a steady stream of callers that Eleanor's modest home could barely accommodate, and she received them all with a grace that surprised even herself, discovering that the confidence Alexander saw in her had begun to take root in a way that no longer depended solely on his perception, but had become something she could feel within herself. Lady Caroline Pembroke sent an elaborate arrangement of white roses with a note expressing her delight at the engagement, and Eleanor read the careful words that contained no acknowledgement of previous cruelty and felt a cold clarity about exactly who this woman was beneath her beauty and social position. Alexander stayed by her side through the exhausting parade of visitors, and when they finally had a moment alone in the early evening, he took her hand and asked if she was certain she wanted to marry into this life, where every moment would be observed and every choice scrutinized. And Eleanor looked at this man who had seen her worth when no one else had, and told him that she would rather face society's attention at his side than live another day in the invisible obscurity she had inhabited before he asked her opinion about the stars. Lady Caroline Pembroke arrived at the Ashford residence on the morning of July the 21st in a carriage far too grand for the modest street, and when Eleanor received her in the drawing-room that had become uncomfortably crowded with the constant parade of visitors seeking to align themselves with the future Duchess of Thornmere, she felt a cold clarity settle over her that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with finally understanding exactly who sat across from her, arranged with careful grace upon the worn settee. Caroline spoke in tones of warm congratulation about the engagement and expressed sentiments of friendship that might have sounded sincere to anyone who had not spent the past 3 months being systematically humiliated by this woman, and Eleanor listened with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes and said very little, because she had learned that silence could be its own form of power when wielded with intention. When Caroline delicately suggested that perhaps past misunderstandings might be forgotten now that Eleanor's position was secured, Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care and said in a voice that was soft but contained steel that she remembered every word spoken in gardens and drawing rooms, and that while she bore no particular ill will, neither would she pretend that cruelty became kindness simply because circumstances had changed. Caroline's facade cracked just slightly, enough for Eleanor to see the calculation beneath. And when the woman departed 10 minutes later with stiff formality, Eleanor felt Alexander's grandmother's ring solid on her finger, and understood that setting boundaries with those who had wounded her was not vindictiveness, but rather a necessary assertion of the worth Alexander had always seen in her. That same afternoon, a letter arrived from Prince Frederick of Saxe-Coburg, bearing a formal apology for any distress his actions may have caused, and expressing his wishes for her happiness. And Eleanor read the careful diplomatic phrasing that took no real responsibility, while maintaining plausible deniability, and felt only a distant sort of pity for a man who understood power and strategy, but had never comprehended the difference between possessing something and genuinely valuing it. Alexander found her in the early evening, standing at her window watching the Thames, where the wreckage of his fleet was still visible in the golden light of sunset. And when he asked what occupied her thoughts, she told him about both visits, and confessed her fear that the ships would remain there for months, as a constant reminder of the spectacle that had transformed her life. He stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar over the past 6 days of their engagement, and told her that the removal would indeed take considerable time, but that he found he did not mind because every person who looked at the Thames would remember what she was worth, and besides, he planned to commission new ships and name every single one after qualities he admired in her, so that his fleet would become a catalogue of her virtues sailing across every sea. Eleanor leaned back against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how strange it was that she now found herself at the center of society's attention, when for 28 years she had been invisible. And that evening, when they attended a musical performance at the home of a duchess who had never acknowledged her existence before, she discovered that navigating sudden visibility required its own form of courage. The morning of August 30th, 1818 dawned clear and golden over London, and Eleanor Ashford woke in her childhood bedroom for the last time as an unmarried woman with the knowledge that by evening she would be the Duchess of Thornmere, a title that still felt surreal despite the 6 weeks since Alexander had proposed to her amid the wreckage of his sunken fleet, still visible in the Thames below. Charlotte arrived at 8 to help her dress, and when Eleanor saw the gown Alexander had commissioned for her, she felt tears prick her eyes, because it was a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that transformed her into something she had never imagined she could be. Though she understood now that the true transformation had occurred not in the external trappings, but in the quiet, internal certainty that she possessed worth regardless of society's measurements. Her father came to her room at 9:30, looking dignified in his best coat, and when he took her hands in his weathered ones and told her he had never been more proud of any accomplishment in his life than he was of the woman she had become, Eleanor embraced him and forgave him silently for all the years he had looked at her with disappointment, because she understood that his own fears had shaped his vision as surely as society's prejudices had shaped her own. The carriage ride to St. George's, Hanover Square, took 20 minutes through streets where people stopped to watch the Baron's modest carriage pass, and Eleanor looked out at the city that had dismissed her for 28 years and felt no bitterness, only a quiet satisfaction that she would leave this church as living proof that their judgments had been as empty as they were cruel. The church was filled to capacity with everyone who mattered in London society, and as Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Lady Caroline Pembroke seated near the front with an expression of forced pleasantness, saw the empty pews where Prince Frederick would have sat had he not fled England in defeat, saw Charlotte weeping openly with joy, but most of all she saw Alexander waiting at the altar in his formal dress, with his eyes fixed on her with such naked emotion that she forgot to be nervous about the hundreds of people watching. He took her hand when she reached him, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was not as composed as he appeared, and when the vicar began the ceremony, she listened to the ancient words about love and commitment, and understood them in a way she never had before, because she had lived without hope for so long that she knew exactly how precious this moment was. Alexander's voice was steady when he spoke his vows, but his eyes were bright with emotion as he promised to honor and cherish her for all the days of his life. And when Eleanor spoke her own vows, she put into them all the gratitude and love and wonder she felt for this man who had seen her truly when she was invisible to everyone else. The ring he slipped onto her finger was a perfect fit. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed her with tender reverence, Eleanor heard the congregation applaud, and knew that society was witnessing not just a wedding, but a vindication of everything they had tried to deny about her value. The journey to Alexander's country estate at Thornmere took 4 hours by carriage through countryside that grew progressively more beautiful as they left London behind on the afternoon of August 30th, 1818, and Eleanor sat beside her husband of 6 hours, watching the landscape transform from the crowded streets she had known all her life to rolling hills and ancient forests, and felt as though she was traveling not just to a new home, but into an entirely different existence where the rules that had governed her first 28 years no longer applied. Alexander held her hand for most of the journey and occasionally pointed out landmarks on his land, and she heard the pride in his voice when he spoke of the tenant families who had lived on these acres for generations, and the improvements he had made to their cottages, and the school he had funded for their children. And she understood that the man society saw as a wealthy duke was in this place simply a steward who took his responsibilities seriously and cared deeply for those who depended upon him. The house itself appeared as they crested a hill just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. A gracious stone manor of warm, honey-colored brick, with ivy climbing its walls and windows that caught the golden light. And Eleanor felt her breath catch, because it was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with grandeur, and everything to do with the sense of home that emanated from its very foundations. The staff had assembled to greet them, and Eleanor was introduced to what felt like dozens of people whose names she tried desperately to remember, but she saw the genuine warmth in their faces when they looked at Alexander, and the curious but not unkind assessment in their eyes when they regarded her. And the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, told her in a soft voice that they were all very happy His Grace had finally brought home a bride. The first 3 days passed in a gentle rhythm of exploration and discovery, as Alexander showed her the house room by room and told her the history of each space, and Eleanor walked through chambers filled with centuries of accumulated beauty, and understood that she was now the keeper of all this history, even as she wondered how a baron's daughter who had owned 3 dresses was supposed to manage an estate of this magnitude. Alexander seemed to sense her uncertainty, because on the evening of their 3rd day at Thornmere, he found her in the library staring at account books, and told her that she did not need to master everything at once, that Mrs. Davies had been managing the household for 20 years and would guide her, and that what he needed from her was not perfection, but simply her presence and her partnership in building a life together. That night, when they retired to the ducal chambers that were now theirs to share, Eleanor felt the last of her nervousness fade as Alexander drew her into his arms with a tenderness that made her feel cherished rather than merely desired. And in the coxeur, privacy of their marriage bed, she discovered that physical intimacy could be an extension of the emotional connection they had built over the past 4 months, a conversation conducted in touches and whispered endearments, and the profound vulnerability of allowing another person to know you completely. They returned to London on September the 15th, 1818, after 2 weeks at Thornmere that had felt like a lifetime and a single moment all at once. And Eleanor sat beside Alexander in the carriage, watching the countryside give way to the familiar streets of the city, and felt the weight of her new title settle more firmly upon her shoulders, because she was no longer merely Eleanor Ashford, who could slip through society unnoticed, but rather the Duchess of Thornmere, whose every action would be observed and discussed and dissected by people who had ignored her existence just 4 months ago. The house Alexander maintained in Mayfair was far grander than her father's modest residence, and Eleanor spent the first 3 days reacquainting herself with London society from this elevated position, while receiving a constant stream of visitors who came ostensibly to pay their respects, but actually to assess whether the woman the Duke had sacrificed his fleet for was managing her unexpected elevation with appropriate grace. Charlotte visited daily, and was the only caller whose presence Eleanor found genuinely comforting, and it was Charlotte who suggested that Eleanor might use her new influence to support other women who found themselves dismissed or overlooked by society's arbitrary standards, and Eleanor felt something ignite within her at the idea, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be invisible. And if her elevation could create opportunities for others, then perhaps it held purpose beyond her own happiness. Within 2 weeks, Eleanor had begun hosting a weekly salon where she invited not just the fashionable and titled, but also blue stockings and female scholars and artists whose work was dismissed because of their sex. And she watched Alexander's pride in her grow as she created a space where intelligence and talent mattered more than breeding or beauty, and together they became known as a couple who valued substance over superficiality in ways that made some of society uncomfortable, but earned them genuine respect from those whose opinions actually mattered. Alexander had begun the process of rebuilding his merchant fleet with the insurance money and the careful investments he had maintained, and Eleanor found herself involved in the planning in ways that surprised them both, because she had a head for figures and a practical approach to problem-solving that complemented his more intuitive business sense. And in the evenings, they would sit together in his study, reviewing contracts and discussing trade routes, and she would feel grateful that he treated her as a true partner, rather than merely an ornamental wife. The wreckage in the Thames had finally begun to be cleared in late September as crews worked to remove the sunken vessels that spelled her name, and Eleanor stood at the window one morning watching the salvage operation and felt Alexander's arms come around her from behind as he murmured that he did not regret a single ship, because they had bought him something infinitely more valuable than any cargo they might have carried. Lady Caroline Pembroke had requested an audience in early October with an air of humility that Eleanor suspected was entirely manufactured, and when the woman who had orchestrated so much cruelty sat in Eleanor's drawing-room and attempted to apologize for past slights, Eleanor listened with cool courtesy, and then made it clear that while she would be civil in public, she would never forget who had tried to destroy her when she was vulnerable, and she saw the flash of resentment in Caroline's eyes and knew that the woman accepted this new hierarchy only because she had no choice. The story of the sunken fleet had spread far beyond London and had taken on an almost mythical quality as it was retold and embellished, and Eleanor would occasionally overhear versions of the tale that bore little resemblance to the actual events. But she did not correct them because she understood that the story had become larger than herself and Alexander and had transformed into a symbol of love that defied convention and calculation. And if it gave hope to other women who felt dismissed, then she was content to let it grow in the telling. The morning of May 15th, 1823, dawned clear and warm over London, and Eleanor Ravenscroft stood at the window of the Mayfair house, watching the Thames sparkle in the early light, and felt Alexander's arms circle her waist from behind as their two children played in the nursery above, and she reflected on how impossible it would have seemed 5 years ago that she would be standing here as the Duchess of Thornmere, with a life so full of love and purpose that some mornings she had to touch the ring on her finger to convince herself it was all truly real. The story of the sunken fleet had become part of London legend now, told and retold until it had taken on the quality of myth, and Eleanor would occasionally overhear young women at her salons speaking of it with a kind of reverent wonder that made her smile, because they did not know that the Duchess they were speaking to was the woman whose name had been spelled across the Thames in ships that had cost a fortune. Alexander's fleet had been rebuilt and was now more prosperous than ever, and Eleanor had discovered a talent for the business of trade that had surprised them both, and together they had created a partnership that extended far beyond their marriage bed into every aspect of their shared life, and she knew that this equality and mutual respect was rarer than any grand gesture and more valuable than any number of sunken ships. Their children, William aged 3 and Catherine just 18 months, would grow up in a household where their mother's intelligence was valued as highly as their father's title, and Eleanor hoped that the world they inherited would be kinder to women who did not fit society's narrow definitions of worth than the world she had known at 28, when she had believed herself destined to fade into obscurity as an unpaid governess or companion. She thought often of the other women like herself, the ones still standing at the edges of ballrooms in outdated gowns, waiting for a life that seemed determined never to arrive, and she used her position to create opportunities where she could, because she remembered too vividly the bitter taste of resignation and the corrosive belief that she was simply not enough and would never be enough in society's cruel estimation. If you are listening to this story and you see yourself in that younger version of Eleanor who believed her life was already over at 28, I want you to understand that it is never too late for transformation, that your worth has nothing to do with whether society has learned to see it yet, and that there are people in this world who will recognize the truth of who you are if you can just hold on long enough for them to find you. Alexander had found her, or perhaps she had found him, and together they had built something that defied every rule she had believed governed her existence. And now, as she stood watching the Thames where the wreckage had been cleared years ago, but the story would never be forgotten, she felt grateful not just for the grand gesture that had changed her life, but for all the quiet moments that had followed, the conversations over breakfast and the shared laughter and the ordinary contentment of being truly known by another person and loved not despite who you are, but because of it.